Welcome everybody to this BRUK webinar on using ontologies to advance behavioural research. We have an hour and a half and we've organised it so that we have half an hour for all of you to ask questions, make comments, and we've divided that into 3 lots of 10 minutes. So if we could have the first slide. Here's the overview of the session. I'm going to start with what challenges are we currently facing in behavioural science, because ontologies directly address this. Then, and the speakers will introduce themselves when we get there, but Deep will talk about what are ontologies and how they can be used. Then Harriet will give some examples. We'll then have some discussion. Then Robert West will talk about using ontologies for synthesizing evidence. Janna Hastings on using for predicting outcomes. And then we'll have a couple of demonstrations that Janna will lead on. Then another 10 minutes Q&As. Then Tom Webb will talk about how is BRUK using ontologies. And finally, Robert on how can behavioural researchers use ontologies in their work. So as you can see, we're going to get through a lot. But at the end, we're also going to give you the option of saying if you'd like to have a follow-up workshop where we'll put a lot of these ideas into practice. It'll be a hands-on workshop. So we'll come back to that at the end. So what challenges are we currently facing in behavioural science? I've outlined 3 here, or I've highlighted 3 here. Behaviour and social sciences are being impeded, first of all, by poorly defined or undefined constructs. And so what ontologies can provide is clarity by improving the precision and our understanding of constructs, so we know what we mean when we talk about particular constructs. And this facilitates developing our models and creating and selecting measures of what we think we're wanting to measure. The second is lack of consistency in the use of terms. We're very well, I think, aware of the fact that people use different words for the same thing and vice versa. And so what ontologies can bring is consistency. And they can do this by every construct having a unique identifier and a unique label for them. So we know exactly what we're meaning. And that can be consistently used across different topics and domains, and also enables our data and our evidence to be computer readable. And that really helps with finding evidence and integrating evidence together. And thirdly, we have fragmented conceptual frameworks. A review of theories I did many years ago identified, I think it was 83 theories of behavior and behavior change, but they were very, very fragmented, a lot of overlap, a lot of missing bits. So what ontologies can do is to bring coherence to the field by providing a unifying conceptual framework that can bring some of these fragmented frameworks together. And this really helps both for integrating models, but also for predicting outcomes. So all of this enables our whole field to become more connected internally, but also it will help to connect our field to other fields and other domains. So that's the overview of the challenges we're facing. And I'm going to hand over to various speakers over the next period to look in more depth at this. So first of all, to address what are ontologies, I'm handing over to Suvodeep Mazumdar. Thank you, Deep.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for the overview on ontologies and the kind of issues that we are seeing in this area. So my name is Suvodeep. You can call me Deep, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Information School in the University of Sheffield. And I've been using ontologies for several years in various different domains. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So the question you might be having is, what is an ontology? So the way we can think of ontologies is by kind of establishing a formal specification for a domain. What that really means is we would like to have a domain where we have a lot of really well-established concepts and relationships between concepts. So we look at creating conceptual schemas, and we give defined meanings to terms and concepts used within this domain. And the other thing that we do is to describe the kind of relationships that exist between concepts. And the whole idea is to create and kind of develop a shared understanding and mutually agreed understanding of a domain. And this is quite important about the mutually agreed aspect of ontologies. And it's important because if you're looking to share our findings, if you're looking to share our data, this is having a mutual agreement is one of the really most important aspects of ontologies. So if you look at it, at the example on the right, where we are depending where you are, we are probably in lunchtime. So that's why it's a good idea to probably talk about pizza. So the example on the right shows a pizza ontology. And you would notice on the left side of the ontology, you have pizzas, and these are different classification of pizza. So you might have veggie pizza or mushroom pizza, and mushroom pizza would also have some kind of topping. Veggie pizza might have a type called margarita, and they would also be linked to different concepts, which is towards the right-hand side of the ontology, which is around topping. So every pizza would have a topping, and toppings can be veggie topping or cheese topping, or you could also have meat topping. And the veggie topping, cheese or meat topping would also have different subtypes around mushroom, tomato, mozzarella. And each of these concepts are connected to these kind of topic, these concepts as well. And the relationship that we are using is has topping. And this is a well-described area for the pizza domain. And if I can move on to the next slide, please. So the question is, we can have this kind of definition, and developing an ontology is really good. It's helpful, but it's also very powerful when we have data being expressed using the ontologies. So we express data as instances in an ontology. And if we can kind of think of, moving away from that conceptualization of pizza, now we want to think about a specific pizza that we encountered. So maybe, how do I describe the pizza that I had last evening? And we might be able to then create instances. And what you see on the right side of the image, these are instances that have been created. And each instance is a type of the object that it points to, or the concept that it points to. So pizza 090621 is a type of pizza. Base 090621 is a type of base, and topping is a type of the topping. And by doing this, we not only encode data within ontologies, but also we preserve the relationships between the different concepts that we can have. So all of the concepts around, say, the toppings or the base, they will also be embedded within the data aspect of the ontology. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So let's talk about studying behavior. So we talked about very generic concept pizza. Hopefully all of us will be able to engage with that. So thinking about studying behavior, we can think of different types of activities, say, for example, swimming behavior. And then swimming behavior might be using a certain equipment. And that makes us kind of talk a bit around the equipment. And then the equipment can have different types. Swimming can also have different types, and then swimming stroke. And swimming would also occur in specific location, and the location could be sea, swimming pool, lake, and so on. So over here, what you see with the dashed lines are the different types of relationships that we can establish within an ontology. So occurs in, or has type, assessed by, use equipment. These are all different relationships that we can embed within ontologies. Next slide, please. So we talked about ontologies of behavior. Now, you might think that we've only looked at swimming, and that itself has quite a large ontology. So it seemed quite a big structure. And if we look at generic behavior, we would be able to create massive ontologies. And that's why we need to kind of exploit the modular nature of ontologies. So on the right, you see an example of an event ontology. And the event can have different elements like space, where did this event happen, temporal aspects of the event, when did it happen, or the situational aspects of the event, or who was involved in the event, and so on. And what we can do is we can have different ontologies and we can connect to different ontologies and thereby extending a basic ontology, and we can have more domain-specific ontologies. So our upper level ontology could be the event aspect, but then we can also have domain-specific ontologies around space, temporal aspects, situations, and so on. The next slide, please. So the question is, how can ontologies be used to tackle challenges? And Susan's kind of laid out some of these ideas and some of these aspects that ontologies can help with. And I'm kind of going a bit more in detail about them. So firstly, ontologies help us have a common understanding of concepts, terminologies, and the semantics. So this helps us around definitions, shared understanding. Because of that, we also employ ontologies as a way to standardize and make our data more consistent, not just across data sets, but also across multiple teams, disciplines, or even geographical locations. And because of that, we can also make use of ontologies because they become more interoperable. They can work across data sets, they can be used to connect across data sets, and they can also be used by software because ontologies are also machine readable. So software can also access ontologies. And also because of software and because of machine readability, and at the same time, it's human readable and understandable as well, because ontologies also involve adding definitions, adding labels, and this helps us understand what different elements of the ontologies are. And finally, integration is one of the key aspects of ontologies. It helps us link across large data sets and potentially discovering relationships that we weren't able to see otherwise. And the next slide, please. Ontologies are graphical structures, and therefore they can allow us with creating complex queries, and complex queries can be a lot more defined and can have a lot more elements that we can express very well. Ontologies also embed reasoning and logic. So you can have, say, for example, restrictions in your dataset. You can say that only one type of pizza can be consumed by one type of person. So you can embed these things and they can help you making sure that your data is standardized. And extensibility, I mentioned about ontologies being very modularized, and therefore ontologies can also be expanded and link across different domains, different domain-specific ontologies. And a lot of ontologies also exist already. So we don't want to create new ontologies, bring new definitions. So instead, what we want to do is to reuse ontologies, reuse the knowledge that's already embedded and already formalized. And that can help us save time and effort. The next slide, please. Okay, so that brings to the end of my session. I'll pass on to Harriet. Over to you, Harriet.
Great, thank you, Deep.
So
yes,
just before we begin, I was remiss in not introducing myself at the beginning, and also to say thank you to Dr. Mazumdar, who's from Sheffield University, and I'm Professor Susan Michie from University College London, and I'm also co-director of Behavioural Research UK, and all the speakers today are working together on a BR UK project on ontologies, which you'll hear something about at the end. So handing over to Dr. Baird, who's also from Sheffield University, just briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Susan. Yes, so good afternoon. My name is Dr. Harriet Baird, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Sheffield. So given the benefits of ontologies, there has been a real growing interest in the use of ontologies in the behavioural sciences. And there are a number of projects like BR UK and initiatives that are seeking to develop ontologies to answer questions of relevance to behavioural research. And in order to kind of coordinate these efforts, some of our colleagues on this webinar, so I think spearheaded by Janna Hastings, they have set up the Behavioural and Social Sciences Ontology Foundry, or BSSO Foundry for short. which basically represents a community of best practice for the development, the adoption, and the use of ontologies within the behavioural and social sciences. So if you're interested in having a little look at the BSSO Foundry, then you can access the BSSO Foundry webpage via this QR code that's on the screen, or there's the web link as well there. And this Foundry will provide you with a list of different ontologies in the field that are of relevance to the social and behavioural sciences. And later in this webinar, Janna is going to give you a demonstration for then how you can explore these ontologies and the concepts within these ontologies in a little bit more detail. But just to give you a kind of brief overview, so as of June 2024, there are currently 6 ontologies listed on the BSSO Foundry. So these include the addiction ontology, which comprises concepts and entities that capture aspects of addiction-based research. There's also the behaviour change intervention ontology, which is an ontology to describe interventions that seek to change people's behaviour. And this ontology, as Deep alluded to, contains different modules relating to the target behaviour that you're trying to change, aspects relating to the population in which the intervention is being delivered, and things related to the mode of delivery and so on. There are also ontologies that have been developed to try to share knowledge and understanding in the field of mental health and mental functioning, and an ontology that describes and captures a range of different affective phenomena, so things like people's emotions and mood. But today, to give you a bit of an example of one ontology that could be relevant to behavioural researchers, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the relationship between behaviours ontology, or the RBBO. So one of the issues in the behavioural sciences is that we tend to study behaviours in isolation. So, for example, we might seek to understand the factors that influence people's engagement in physical activity, or we might try to develop an intervention that intends to increase the frequency with which people engage in physical exercise. However, we know from research that changing one behaviour can lead to changes in another. For example, an intervention that seeks to increase the amount that somebody exercises may lead to less frequent car use, and it may lead to a reduction in smoking, perhaps, if you've got the goal of perhaps being healthier. But it could also lead to perhaps other behaviours, such as consuming more calories to compensate for the amount of exercise that you're doing. Now, fortunately, the evidence that we need to understand how different behaviours are related already exists, because any study that reports the kind of correlation between 2 or more different behaviours can speak to this question of how behaviours are related. However, what we're missing is an ontology that's needed in order to gather and process these relationships in order to collate the evidence to speak to how different behaviours are related. So the aim of the relationship between behaviours ontology, or the RBB ontology for short, is to capture and describe evidence relating to the relationship between behaviours. And as Deep alluded to earlier, sometimes we have different modules or component ontologies. And you can think of the RBBO as comprising 3 kind of different modules. So first of all, if we're going to capture data on the relationship between different behaviours, then we need an ontology or module of the ontology that details the whole range of human behaviours that people can engage in. So here you can see, as part of the RBBO behaviour, a huge list of different human behaviours. So it's got things like physical performance behaviour, posture behaviour, prosocial behaviour, sexual behaviour, and so on. So this part of the ontology captures which behaviours, multiple behaviours, we're looking at to establish the relationship between them. Then we also need a part of the ontology that's going to capture the information that documents what the relationship between these behaviours are. So typically, we might use correlations as an indicator of to what extent one behaviour is related to a change in another behaviour. So the RBBO, Properties of Studies Measuring Behaviour, details all the different aspects of the studies that measure how these different behaviours may be related. So it includes things like the correlation, and this can be broken down further into the different types of correlations that we might observe. It can include things like the study design. So did it use a cross-sectional or experimental design? What was the sample size? And so on. And then finally, we've got the RBBO behaviour properties. Now, this part of the ontology is still kind of in development, but it basically seeks to describe the properties of the behaviours that we're exploring. So, you know, different behaviours can differ on various different dimensions or properties. For example, to what extent they are perhaps habitual behaviours, to what extent they might be considered legal behaviours in different contexts, to what extent they might involve a certain amount of effort or skill. So the RBBO behaviour properties also helps us to describe the properties of those behaviours that we're exploring when we're looking at the different relationships between behaviours. And that could speak to interesting questions, you know, with respect to whether we expect stronger relationships between behaviours that actually have similar underlying properties. So that's just a very brief overview of one ontology that we've developed in the social and behavioural sciences that might be of interest to those of you on this call. So I think now we're going to move on to a 10-minute Q&A session. So I'll just stop sharing my slides and then hopefully invite everyone from the webinar to turn their cameras on so we can answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, Harriet. So there is a Q&A box, so please do put any questions as we're talking into it. But I don't think we have any in it at the moment. Yes, we do. That's great. Good. From Midori Nishioka. Are there standards of quality for ontologies in terms of the evidence behind how concepts are grouped together and relationships between behaviours? For example, meta-analytic evidence, CFA, what's the CFA? Anybody here know? Or expert agreement. I'm sure it's something factor analysis for CFA. So yeah, the answer is yes, that there are. And the Human Behaviour Change Project published a paper on this. The first author was Emma Norris, looking at sort of quality standards for ontologies, especially in terms of behavioural ontologies. But who else would like to answer this in more depth? I'm thinking either Janna or Deep might like to.
Deep, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, so well, I was kind of thinking a bit around that, and one of the things I would say is that in terms of ontologies, there is a lot of aspect around co-design. So if we are looking at how concepts are brought together, how concepts are maybe hierarchically organized, there is quite a lot of work that we need to do in bringing the community together and work together as a part of the ontology creation process. So that's where I would say that that's the other element that we would probably need to think about as well. One of the reasons why we need to do that is to also understand how the technical aspect of the ontology, so the reason why we are using the ontology, how can that be best satisfied as well? So I'm also looking at the human dimensions of creating the ontology. So that's another perspective we should think of.
Yeah,
Janna, do you want
to? From my perspective, completely agree with Susan and with Deep what's been said before. I would say that it's important. There are kind of best practices, which is not exactly the same thing as quality, but of course it means that you have then an agreement among a lot of different researchers coming from different perspectives on what really makes a good ontology fit for purpose. And those best practices tell us things like using clear, unambiguous terminology, giving definitions for things, kind of spelling out what you're talking about and following the approved logical sort of rules for how you build ontologies. And all of these things we can check and test that an ontology is following those best practices. And then there's another dimension, which is how good is the content of the ontology, which is really how you figure that out is almost an art, I would say, of really getting closer to understanding the domain itself that you're trying to represent. And there will be many interesting ways to design experiments which test how good the ontology is. Can you derive a certain inference from it, and so on?
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. The next question we have is from Alina Hallinan, who's asking, are there any plans to expand the behavior ontology with e.g. attributes of the behavior? And then gives a link, and also things like frequency and complexity of the behavior, private versus public behavior. Now, the ontology that Harriet was talking about is specifically to look at relationships between behavior, but then we also have a more comprehensive human behavior ontology. So Harriet, if I could ask you to address that with RBBO, and then Robert, I'll come to you, who's been leading the work within the Human Behaviour Change Project, developing the human behaviour ontology, to say something about that ontology. Harriet.
Yes, and Tom might want to jump in as well here. So I think the RBBO properties of behaviour is trying to capture exactly what's been referenced in this question. So I've not clicked on the link yet, so I don't know what that paper is saying. But the idea is so the RBBO uses the behaviour change intervention ontology in terms of the list of behaviours, because they've done already some fantastic work detailing the full range of human behaviour, and the extension of the work that we did at the University of Sheffield as part of the Turbo project was to look in more detail about trying to capture the different properties or attributes of different behaviour. And that's very much a work in progress. So I think initially the list that we've got in the RBBO properties is kind of attributes that have come to us as we've been engaging in this work, but it absolutely needs to be extended and does not represent a comprehensive list of attributes. But I totally agree. I think it's really important that we are capturing, when we're talking about behaviour, these aspects that you're mentioning, you know, whether the frequency with which the behaviour is being performed, the complexity, whether it's addictive, and so on. So that's something that, is hopefully going to continue to develop, especially with input from the wider research community as well, of the kind of properties and things that are important for us as behavioural scientists. Do you want
Thanks,
to
Harriet?
add
I'll go to Robert to talk about the human behaviour ontology, and then Tom, if you'd like to add to the discussion, that would be great.
Hi, yes, in the human behavior ontology and the paper, someone will put the link to the paper in the chat. It covers the classes of behavior. It also covers relating the behaviors to other types of things, like, for example, start time, stop time, and other who's participating in the behavior, etc., what the goals might be, and so on. So there's a number of generic relations and some bespoke relations that allows you to characterize the behavior. But there's also a relation called has behavioral attribute. And that then allows us to link specifically a particular behavior to a set of attributes. And we've identified, as well as what Sheffield has done, we've identified a number of specifically behavioral attributes, such as, for example, behavioral form, which is a very generic one, which would then act as a sort of as a sort of superclass for a whole bunch of things that might be very different for different behaviors. Just to give you a very specific example, if it's smoking behavior, then you could use behavioral form to you could have subclasses relating to depth of inhalation, for example, which is obviously potentially important. So there's lots of potential there for describing attributes, and one of the things I think we've really discovered in trying to characterize behaviors is that just using classes is almost certainly rarely going to be enough. In order to properly characterize behaviors in a way that we need to for our purposes, we're going to be having to combine classes with lots of attributes and other relations.
Thanks, Robert. Tom, did you want to add to that?
I'll just add one sentence just to thank Alina for the link. I haven't seen that paper, but the table that the link points to suggests 3 attributes: repetitiveness of the behavior, cost of the behavior, and public visibility. So I think, like Harriet says, one of our tasks for behavioral scientists is to compile that list of the key behavioral attributes that we think are important, use ontologies to describe those, and then we can start to build the evidence base.
Thanks very much. And it'd be very helpful if people could put links to whatever they talk about, so that people could see them and follow up. The human behaviour ontology is on the Welcome Open Research as part of the Human Behaviour Change project collection. Okay, so Alina says, great, thank you. Small follow-up. I've only recently come across this term attribute-based theorising. So I'd love to know if there are other terms like this that I could follow up on and explore. Blank from me, but if others know of any, just pop it into the chat. Good, John O'Neill. Has there been any preliminary efforts to determine if or where there may be mesh points where separate ontologies become concerned with the same ontological elements? Conceptually, it may trigger ideas around new areas worth exploring. So I'm sure that you're meaning more than, oh good, Tom will come to more than how I read this, because obviously one of the big purposes of ontologies is that they interconnect with each other. So yes, many ontologies are concerned with the same elements, but it's actually very relevant to one of the projects that we're doing in BR UK. So Tom, over to you.
That was exactly what I was going to say. Yes, John, there definitely are mesh points, and one of our tasks is to have a process by which we can better link ontologies, because at the moment they aren't necessarily that easy to link, and that's one of the things I'll talk about that we're doing within BR UK.
Thanks, Tom. From Asia Pauletta, hello everyone. I'd like to know if this change behaviour ontology suits for designing research utilisation interventions among different populations such as nurses. May I ask for a paper about this topic? Thanks. Or maybe somebody could put a link into the upper level of the behaviour change intervention ontology. So you mentioned change behaviour ontology, but actually it's behaviour change intervention ontology. So it really focuses on aspects of the intervention, able to describe in great detail the intervention in its context. So as well as having the actual descriptor of the intervention itself, the text behaviour change techniques, the dose, the schedule, who's delivering, etc. Yeah, it's got quite a lot about delivery. Also, we have, and we've mentioned the behaviour side of it, but also we do have the context. So a population ontology, which is due to be submitted every day, any day, the paper reporting that, we have got a population ontology, which has in huge detail how you actually specify the population that you're targeting with the intervention. And similarly with settings, we have a similar thing for settings. So hopefully somebody has put in the link for that. And I'm super interested in those because they're very relevant for behaviour change practitioner. Not talked about enough. Seems like important latent variables and understanding the target behaviour well. So would anybody like to pick up that comment in terms of how one brings into thinking about behaviour, causes of behaviour change in terms of particular population groups? If you were online, we'd be able to get you to elaborate a little more about what you're thinking about. But unless anybody particularly wants to come in on that, I mean, what I'd say is that for all of behaviour change, whether it's planned as in behaviour change interventions or unplanned, in order to understand it, one absolutely needs to understand the context. You know, who is, in terms of planned interventions, delivering it, but who are the population whose behaviour we're talking about? What behaviour are we talking about? What setting are we talking about? What events have happened, for example, before any planned intervention took place? And the behaviour change intervention ontology, which I think has probably thousands of constructs in many, many different sub-ontologies, seeks to be able to define all these things in enough detail that one can really synthesize evidence across many, many studies and know what we're talking about. So, for example, you talked about behaviour change practitioners, Alina, and you know, we know there are many different overall types of practitioner. You know, we may have physiotherapists, occupational therapists, psychologists, etc. But they have different degrees of experience and training. This needs to be captured. They are operating in different countries. This needs to be captured. There's many aspects of, you know, even a health professional practitioner that needs to be captured, and this can be done with the population ontology. So I'm sorry we can't give you the link, but it really is any day now that this will be submitted to open research. And if you want to keep updated, do sign on to the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology website, and we can send you newsletters. So I think that's a very good point to hand over to Professor Robert West. Maybe you can introduce yourself, who's going to talk about using ontologies to synthesize evidence. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm Robert West, and I'm Professor Emeritus of Health Psychology at University College London, and I've been working with Susan for many years on the Human Behaviour Change Project, and with Janna and other members of the Human Behaviour Change Project team, and now obviously collaborating with the Sheffield team as well. So I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes giving you a very, very brief overview of how you can use ontologies for one of the use cases, which is annotating papers, for example, for meta-analysis and systematic reviews and meta-regressions and so on, or indeed, as we've done, for input into machine learning algorithms. Next slide, please. So your task here is, when you're annotating a paper, is to take a document, such as a paper here. This was a randomized trial that I was involved in. And then you've got to extract information from it, which is going to be useful when you're trying to synthesize the evidence. And so essentially what you're ending up with is some kind of structured data, which will often be a spreadsheet. It may be what's known as a JSON file, which is a more, I would say, flexible way of representing data. But ultimately, probably, when you're going to be putting this into some sort of regression or meta-analysis or even a machine learning model, you're probably going to be flattening it out into a spreadsheet. So that's your task. Next slide, please. And the steps in the process then are going to be something like this. So what you have to do, of course, is to begin with is you're creating instances, as Deepa has talked about earlier. You use the ontology to structure data, and the data consists of what we call instances. So they'll need IDs. So you have a study ID, which could, for example, you might use the DOI from a paper, although that can be complicated because the paper might have more than one study in it. Anyway, you want a unique ID for the study. But then, crucially, you need to create another ID for a group within the study. If it's a randomized trial, that would be a study arm, for example. But it might not be. And even if there's only one group, you'll want to have an ID for that group, just for consistency. Almost certainly. Then for each study group or study arm, if it's a randomized trial, for example, you've got to identify all the scenario components that you're interested in. For example, intervention content, the study population, the context, all the things that we cover in the ontology. Then for each study component, what you need to do is to identify all the key entities within that you want to annotate, and there may be anything up to, there may be several hundred of them in a really, really well annotated paper, or there may be as few as 40 or 50, but there'll be a lot. And then for each entity, your job is to find ontology classes and record their details, that record the details that led you to assign that class, and give the context of the class that you found in the paper. Next slide, please. So that's a lot to take in. But what I'm going to do now is just to share my screen and show you what the end result might look like in a spreadsheet. So I'm going to take over sharing. If I can, I think what I want is sorry, I need. This is not what I was expecting when it came to the
Harriet,
screen.
you need to allow Robert to share, maybe?
No, she's allowing me to share the screen, but but the screen that what I'm expecting to share is a whole screen, and
it's the green box. It's the green box next to the share.
Sorry?
There's a message saying it's the green box next to the chat.
Yeah, no, I've got that. I know how to share. It's the things that are coming up on the screen are not what I was expecting to see. Okay, here we go. Let's try this one. Okay, so you should be able to see that. This is just an example of a few entries in a spreadsheet, and I'll just very quickly go through them with you so that you can see. First of all, you've got your study ID. I've just called that 1. You'd usually put a document title in, then you'd put a group ID. That you probably give it a group name so that you can refer to it easily. Then you'd have your scenario component, which is taken from a drop-down list. Which looks something like this. This is one that I've created, and we'll share this for you so that you can use this if you want. Then you'd take the ontology entity URL, which will consist of a full web address, the last bit of which is the IRI, or the unique identifier for the class, and then the labels. And the label here is agree behavioral goal BCT. So you've identified that entity. That's its ID. Sometimes if it's something like age, then you'd want to put a value in there, like if it's mean age, for example, you'd want to put in 40.5 or something, and then you'd put in the context, which is the text that you used to identify this. And then you can usually, it's quite a good idea to have a comment field as well. And you do that basically for all of your entities. So there'll be one row per entity. So a given document could have as many as 100 or more rows in it. And then what you do is you just write a script to merge the files so that you can create your flat database. If we just go back to the slides, that's basically it. So I think that I think the next slide is going on to the next section. Yeah. So you probably got quite a few questions on it, but we'll leave that till after this session.
Great. So yes, please put your questions into the Q&A, and then we have another Q&A session coming up after this section. So I'm going to talk about another part, another thing that you can use ontologies for. Before I start, just to say, introduce myself. I'm Janna Hastings. I'm the assistant professor at the University of Zurich in the Faculty of Medicine, but also an associate of the Center for Behavior Change at UCL. And next slide, please, Harriet. So as Robert presented, you can use ontologies to annotate literature and to use them as part of the system, which you can do some sort of meta-analysis or systematic review with. Now, one of the ways that you can do such a system would be to be able to develop something which could learn from a big annotated data set in order to predict outcomes in hypothetical scenarios. So we would like to do this because we would like to use the combined published evidence in order to inform future intervention choice, design, research design, and to answer questions about the sort of possible hypothetical scenarios for which we don't have evidence yet. So this is why we try to predict intervention outcomes given an annotation data set. And this task basically translates into, given some structured data and text, so this, what Robert was showing before, some annotated data set about an intervention, that describes a behavior change intervention scenario, we would like to predict the intervention outcome. And if we could have the next slide. So the data set itself is the annotated randomized controlled trials of smoking cessations interventions. This was a data set that we worked with in the Human Behavior Change Project, but of course you can apply the same method to any annotated data set in order to further predict other scenarios. So we're working with smoking cessation, but there could be other examples. You can apply ontologies to any kind of topic or intervention scenario. So here you see the PDFs and the tables inside the PDFs, which are particularly the elements from which outcome values and relevant population information and other parts of the intervention description are typically extracted. So you may have some data being extracted from the text, you may have some data being extracted from the tables, and then these different extracted elements are brought together into the data set. Next slide, please. So the role of the ontology, and I think this is really a crucial point to understand, is to provide the types of the different elements that you want to extract. So this is a sort of conceptual illustration of what that means. So you have here a subset of a part of the ontology. This is in fact a part of the behavior change intervention ontology mode of delivery sub-ontology. So here you're talking about different ways that interventions can be delivered. And what you see here, for example, is one option is a digital sort of device mode of delivery, and another option is a face-to-face mode of delivery. And here you see parts of the text, in fact, just the abstract text. I mean, typically we would extract values from the full paper, but it's much easier to illustrate with an abstract because it fits on one slide. So here you see bits of the text which would indicate that a face-to-face mode of delivery had been used, and this text would then be associated in the data extraction with that ontology class. And there are different types of annotations. You can have some which just say, okay, this feature is present or absent. You can have some which specifies a value, and you can have some which specify a number. Next slide, please. So I will not go into the details, but what you can do with this data set is train a machine learning algorithm. That's one of the ways which you can use the data set, and that is what enables you to make predictions in hypothetical scenarios, because the machine learning model is able to make predictions after it's learned from the examples that you give it based on your annotated data set. Another way to use the annotated data set would be to do a regression study or some other statistical analysis, which is a different sort of approach, but in the end it changes what kind of question you can answer on it. And in this case, we wanted to be able to answer questions on hypothetical scenarios, so we trained a machine learning model. Next slide, please. One aspect of this machine learning model, which is perhaps particularly interesting, is that it learns based on the ontology, it learns rules, and these rules you can then look at. So aspects or elements of the feature space, which we've annotated based on the ontology, such as age, they appear in the rules sort of transparently. And this is different to other machine learning approaches where you don't have insights into, you don't necessarily have insights into the internal working and feature space that the model has used, because it's not transparent in that way. So this is a really exciting thing that you get out of combining an ontology with a machine learning based approach. Next slide, please. So here you see an example screenshot of the interface for the prediction tool. And what you can see here is that you can select features, and then it will calculate the prediction and also show you the explanations in an inset. I think we will move on now to the demonstrations. This was just one case study, which is in prediction, but what I'm going to talk about now and what I'm going to demonstrate is much more about just finding ontologies and finding terms in ontologies. So for the demonstration part, I will need to share my screen. I hope this works. Well, let me try. So what I wanted to share with you, first of all, that you have multiple ontology repositories. Now, we already talked about the BSO Foundry, and apologies that that link didn't work for everybody. The QR code, we will update the QR code for the future, but here you see the BSO Foundry, and this has a small list of ontologies which we have identified and incorporated so far, which are directly relevant to the behavioral and social sciences. But in fact, there are many, many ontologies which are relevant for other domains, including in biomedicine. So here you see, for example, an ontology repository which allows searching. This is called the Ontology Lookup Service. And here you can search the content of all of these more than 100 different ontologies at the same time. So this gives you a tool which you can use to sort of explore the full wide space of all possible ontologies for a term that you're interested in. And so I think this is really neat. So for example, you can search for behavior change, and you see especially the behavior change intervention ontology shows up. And if I jump to a particular term there, you see that term in this ontology repository. Now, of course, this is not the only ontology repository which allows you to search this functionality. The behavior change intervention ontology has, in fact, its own website, which you can also use to search the behavior change intervention ontology. But the benefit of this tool is that it searches across a very wide range of different ontologies at the same time. So you can use it for discovery purposes. One other thing I wanted to show you was that you can also visualize content from within behavioral, from within BSO Foundry ontologies through this visualization tool, which allows you to look up content in one or multiple of the ontologies which are listed here, and then get out a visualization for that content. And so here you see the behavior change technique. You can zoom it and zoom out, and it shows the classification hierarchy, so you can explore sort of which additional terms have been classified beneath that. So that was what I wanted to show. So just in terms of sort of coming from very broad repositories, which are covering not only behavioral and social sciences, but other domains as well, through our behavioral and social sciences focused repository, and then to the individual websites of specific ontologies, which may offer other features that the wider repositories don't have. So if we could have the slides again. Great. So this was what I've tried to demo, and I think that we will have some time for Q&A coming up now.
Thanks, Janna. In fact, I jumped on to keep us to time, but we only have one question at the moment. I think it'd be really good if we could go back to your prediction slide and you just spend a couple of minutes talking about that, because that is a really powerful use of ontologies, being able to go to organize evidence into ontologies and then allow policymakers or planners or practitioners, whoever, to say, you know, this is my population, this is my setting, this is my behavior of interest. What techniques or interventions might be most useful for this scenario? Or if I were to use these techniques in this situation, what's the likely outcome? So are we able to get back to that slide? Lovely, thank you. Thanks, Janna. You're on mute.
Sorry, so I wonder if it doesn't make sense to do this also interactively. Maybe Harriet, I could share again my screen, and then we could just look. I could talk through this interface. So of course, let's see. So here we have that interface that I had a screenshot of, and of course it's it's at the moment when you start out, you don't have any intervention components selected, but we could select one, for example, pharmacological support or reduce negative emotions, and you would see that this display, which is the prediction, is automatically updated. You can also change your sort of population characteristic in terms of the proportion male or female, or the mean age. We could make our participants in our study or our hypothetical study older. And in each case, you see the predicted effectiveness of the intervention. This feature here is how often they were smoking before they attempted cessation. And here you have some information about the study itself, so characteristics of how the outcome was measured or what type of outcome it was. And we have these features, which were the ones that were annotated in the data set. They are each linked to particular ontology elements. So again, this ontology-driven machine learning algorithm behind the scenes is picking up the information from the annotated data set. I'm not sure what else we could demonstrate about this particular interface or prediction tool, but just to say, of course, it's only based on a limited amount of data, and research is ongoing how we can expand and generalize, but I'm pretty excited about the potential of this kind of technology.
Thanks, Janna. And yes, it's very much proof of principle, but as you say, it's got really exciting possibilities. Again, this has been published on Welcome Open Research, so if somebody could put the link in for that paper, people who'd like to read more about it can do so. So, so far we only have one outstanding question, as I can see, from Kelly Ogden-Chouette. What is your preferred language for script writing? So, computer scientists amongst us, what's your preference?
So I would say, just in terms of the Human Behavior Change Project and the associated tools that I just demonstrated, everything is Python based, and we do produce our sort of reusable library components in Python. But I mean, language these days is not, it's more of a personal preference, I think. You can do just about everything in many different languages. That's my take. Do some others?
Okay, anybody else have any other takes?
Maybe I can also jump in. So like Janna, Python is also one of my go-to scripting languages. I do use surprisingly JavaScript quite a lot, because that's also, particularly if you're looking at interactive elements, then JavaScript also works quite well. If you have web-based applications, and even for backend applications, that's also one of those things that you end up using quite a lot these days.
Okay, great. So if there are no other questions, I mean, what we've heard about so far is using ontologies to actually report your interventions, your scenario, so annotating papers, and this allows you to synthesize evidence, both human beings, but also by using ontologies, computational methods. And we've also heard about how ontologies can be used for predicting outcomes in particular scenarios. Another important role for ontologies is bringing different silos of knowledge together, because even in my own, even if you say take health psychology, which is just one part of psychology, very different but relevant evidence in the areas of, say, just take some of the most frequent behaviors related to health, eating, physical activity, drinking alcohol, smoking, and then there's a huge number of different areas around other parts of psychology, and we need to bring these together. And that's just psychology, but what about all the behavioural and social sciences? And that's just the behavioural and social sciences. You know, what about linking with, you know, biological and genetic aspects? So really, if we're going to make the kind of transformational change in our society, in our science, that society requires, given the massive, huge challenges that require behavioural change, you know, from climate change to pandemics, then we really need to be able to link up data more efficiently and do more with our data in terms of developing predictive models and bringing evidence at scale and at speed together, so we have a proper, you know, big comprehensive data set to draw from, rather than, you know, the very, very underpowered types of data sets we tend to get with the sort of traditional systematic reviewing that doesn't use ontologies, that doesn't use computation, and therefore can only answer very simple questions, and very rarely can even look at simple interactions in any powerful way that we can really be confident about. So, you know, this can open up a huge new world. Tom?
I just wanted to follow on from what you said, Susan. I mean, that's clearly one of the real strengths of ontologies. They allow people to come together, to agree, and for the community to share an understanding. But I also want to point out, I don't want that to put people off, because I think a lot of scientists disagree with each other in constructive ways. So, you know, we debate what we mean by various concepts and how they should be used. And ontologies don't force you to agree. What they force you to do is to agree that you disagree and to specify how you disagree. So you might have a concept like attitude, for example, and that concept could be defined in two different ways. And then you could decide whether they are separate entities, in the sense that they're actually sufficiently different that we need separate entities with different unique identifiers within the ontology. They might be subclasses, children of the parent class attitude. But working through these things, I think, is really exciting and allows us to formalize these sort of interesting debates that scientists have. So it's about agreeing and working together, but not necessarily forcing people to all think the same and to think about concepts in the same way.
I think that's a really important point, Tom, because that's something we haven't really talked about yet in this webinar, is using it actually as a tool of thinking and a tool of understanding where other people are coming from and what can we agree about, and as you say, why might we disagree when we do disagree. And there's a bit of work that Janna and I are involved with, Wellcome funded research, looking at developing an ontology of some important parts of mental health, anxiety, depression, and psychosis. And, you know, we're very much going to be using the ontology in this sort of way. Janna, do you want to say something about that, the way in which ontologies have been used to actually develop consensus? And this is something very different than forcing everybody to use the same language or the same concepts in particular situations.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that goes in both directions. So humans often communicate using words where everybody thinks they're understanding and communication is successful. But then when you really ask them, they've all understood something slightly different. So we do this implicitly. Now, when we create an ontology, we are forced to write down what everything means. That's part of the work. And when you do this, this is when you suddenly realize that actually everybody in the room, different stakeholders, Deep mentioned the co-design aspect of ontology development. If you bring together different stakeholders, you'll realize that they actually have different ideas in their mind. So it makes that implicit explicit, and that's one of the ways that then you can talk about it. Then you can try and achieve a common understanding. But it goes beyond that. So that's like if you're developing one ontology, but there are all sorts of different ways that conceptualizations can differ between different types of research that we do, different types of investigation, different ways of thinking about the domain. And so some of those become clearer when you've got different ontologies and you look at how those different ontologies are sort of foundationally taking a different perspective on the domain. And this can help you to agree where you disagree and how the different things are related to each other. So bringing together different ontologies that take really radically different perspectives sometimes. In the mental health field, this is definitely the case. That's There are different ways of thinking about mental health, which are radically different. And you can look at how these can be related without compressing them into one thing, because this will never work and won't even be useful. So I see this as, valuable exercise.
I think a very good example of that is addiction, which is a very contested term. And maybe after Deep spoken, Robert, you might want to just talk to how ontologies have been helpful in addressing that. Deep.
I was kind of picking up from what Janna was saying about getting people on board in creating and agreeing amongst ourselves. What are the terminologies? How are they related? And one of the other aspects is the cyclic nature of ontology development. So we just don't do it once and leave it as this is the ground truth, but we have to do it continuously. We have to keep engaging user communities, stakeholders, and kind of iterating over the ontology just to make sure that is the data getting captured appropriately? Is the data preserving all of these relationships? Or do we have another way of reconceptualizing the ontology that we have to think of? So I think that's also quite important for us to kind of set out that we are looking at an iterative process as well.
Thanks. Robert.
Yeah, addiction is a really good example of contested terminology, and which is characterized and framed in terms of contested conceptualization, when in fact it's not really. And so ontologies can help to decontest that by allowing people to talk about what they want to talk about using a terminology that they want to use, but without people getting confused as to what it is that they're talking about. And if you just look at the definition of addiction itself, for example, for some very prominent addiction researchers, that they would consider addiction to be a behavior. Okay, so that's a process. A behavior is a thing that people do, or a behavior pattern is a collection of processes. For other people, and that's perfectly fine. You can define addiction in a way that allows, for which that makes sense. But for other people, and probably more commonly, addiction is some kind of disposition. So it's a characteristic that a person has at a particular time or over a particular time, which results in a particular behavior pattern. And so what we've done is to help people to unpack that and to try to at least capture some of the more commonly used ways in which people conceptualize addiction in a way that doesn't prejudge the theory underpinning it. So if you wanted to say, well, addiction is a disorder of the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, you could do that, but it would be sort of basically getting confused between what causes addiction and what we want to talk about when we talk about addiction. So we've written a paper on it and tried to help to bring consensus and consistency in the language. And very briefly, the other thing that people often get confused about is the distinction between, or the lack of distinction between, addiction and dependence. And actually, in common usage, they are used very often differently, with addiction being very much a disposition around powerful motivations to engage in a behavior, like drug taking and so on, whereas dependence is more commonly thought of as a situation where in the absence of a drug, or when you can't have a drug that you've got used to, you get impairment. And so so dependence is very much around sort of abnormal functioning in the absence of something you've got used to. So we can really help, I think, people to clarify by using ontologies in this way.
Thanks, Robert. And before we move on, just to say that I think the point Deep made is really important, that ontologies aren't fixed. They are very moving, growing things, both as a result of the ontology being used and seeing, well, some things work, some things don't work, and also bringing different perspectives into using the ontology that can really improve it, but also because the science moves on and needs to be captured within an ontology. So it's very important to remember that. And one of going back to one of the questions early on about qualities of ontologies, they should be easy to be able to give feedback, and that feedback needs to be looked at, and so that ontologies have a team that are responsible for curating and updating the ontologies. And sadly, if you go and look at some of the ontologies, when you search them, sadly, some of them aren't being kept up to date as well as they should be. So this is an absolutely essential idea of a good ontology. It's a living thing that is living and growing in order to be maximally useful and usable, and also maximally representative of our cutting edge understanding of our field. Okay, so now we move on to Tom Webb again, and he's going to talk about how BRUK is using ontologies. And do introduce yourself, Tom.
Thank you, Susan. So I'm Tom Webb. I'm a psychologist at University of Sheffield. And I think 5 years ago, I hadn't heard of ontologies. So I went and spoke to a former colleague of Deep's, Fabio Cidavegna, about the problem of trying to understand the relationship between behaviours. And Fabio said to me, you need an ontology. And since then, it's been a really interesting journey that I've taken to learn more about this concept and really understand the potential of ontologies. So we can have the next slide, please, Harriet. It's probably obvious by now that the BRUK team recognise the value of ontologies, and we're big fans of ontologies. We think they have the potential to create and document a shared understanding of concepts, ideas, and then to use that shared understanding, we can use them to structure data sets, describe our interventions and our measures, annotate papers, and understand theoretical perspectives. So the BRUK project will further that work. So we're continuing a project started by the Human Behaviour Change Project team, which uses ontologies to integrate and compare theories. So you remember Susan mentioned the 63 theories, I think it was 63 in her introduction. But we also recognise that relatively few behavioural researchers are using ontologies. And so we want to help people to use ontologies in their work. And we're doing that by raising awareness of ontologies and upskilling people, yourselves, via webinars such as this, and workshops like the one we're going to tell you about in a moment. And we're also developing tools that we hope will help people to work with ontologies. So Robert described a tool that allows people to use ontologies to annotate data sets. And we'll develop that further in a project called the Demo Data Project. We're also developing a tool for linking ontologies and identifying overlap between ontologies. So this was the question that John asked about earlier, but showing also why doing that is worthwhile. Why is it helpful to link ontologies together? What's it enable us to do? So that's a project called the Demo Inter Project. And then we want to collate these and other tools together, probably using definitely using the Behavioural and Social Sciences Ontology Foundry, which Harriet mentioned earlier. So if you want to read more about the projects that we're working on within this demonstration project, it'll all be happening over the next year. So I think we're aiming to finish these 4 pieces of work by February next year. Then please visit the Open Science Framework. There's a link on that slide. That'll take you through to the main Open Science Framework page for the BRUK project, where you can see all of the work that BRUK is doing. But if you scroll down to on the right-hand side of the project, look for Demo Project 3, you'll see these specific projects. We've got protocols for each of these which describe what we're trying to do. And we'd very much welcome any feedback. Do get in touch with us if you've got suggestions or ideas for what we might be doing. So I think I'm going to hand over to Robert now.
Right. Okay. So very quickly then, to give you an overview, of how we as behavioural researchers can use ontologies in our work. If you go to the next slide, I've basically just summarised them here. Now, going through the research process, there's actually loads of different ways. I've just summarised 4 important ones here. First of all, let's think about writing protocols. So this is protocols for studies and things that you might want to measure, constructs that you might want to have as a sort of core ideas within your study. They might be mechanisms of action for interventions. They might be intervention components. They might be features of the population and so on. But so when you're right at the beginning, when you're designing your study, which might be an intervention evaluation, for example, then you can explore ontologies to see, well, okay, what constructs are there out there that have been nicely and well defined and ideally have good measures associated with them that we can use. So ideally, we would use ontologies right from the get-go at that point, because it can be quite hard later on to retrofit ontology constructs onto things if you haven't used them to begin with. Now, the reality, of course, is that because ontologies are incredibly new and they're still very much developing, and a lot of entities that you would want to be able to refer to aren't covered in ontologies, because you know, there's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them potentially. You know, a lot of what we do is going to be retrofitting to existing papers and protocols and so on. But that's ideal. So if you're starting a study, think about using ontologies in writing a protocol. The next one is writing up study reports, and this is where you would go through your you can write the report in the way that you would normally do so, and then sort of like self-annotate it. So that you get all your key constructs and you identify ontology classes and expressions within the paper that you can then put in, for example, into a supplementary file. Now, to help with this, if you're doing a randomized controlled trial or a pilot or feasibility trial, there is the paper authoring tool, which I and others have developed, which is a free tool. Someone may put a link online to it. It's just paperauthoringtool.com, which will help you to do it. What it does is it helps you to write the paper, but it also helps you to ontologize your key classes, and it will produce what's known as a JSON file, a machine readable version of the paper with all your classes and all your information all already there, so you don't have to do it again. Then we've already talked about annotating study reports. So this would be you know, if either you've self-annotated it, or you're more likely you're coming to someone else's paper and you're going to annotate it. And I explained that a little bit earlier. But then very usefully, ontologies can be used to annotate databases, so that and there's some very large projects around on trying to make databases more interoperable. We really need to be able to join up databases much better than we can at the moment. And there are big projects on the go for doing that, but ontologies are a great way of doing it. And so what you can do is, with your databases, is you can take each of your variables that you've got and you can create descriptions and metadata, which includes ontology classes and expressions, which will give a really clear and consistent and interoperable characterization of what exactly is that variable represents. So if it's an outcome, behavioral outcome measure, it can capture all of the information about it. You know, what was the time period over which you're interested? What's the class of behavior, and so on? How is it measured, and so on? So annotating databases is potentially an incredibly valuable way of using ontologies. So I think that was the only slide that I had for this.
Thanks, Robert. Good. So I know that we've given a lot of information, a lot of it really quite abstract. There's no questions yet. If you've got any questions, this is your chance to ask them. As I said, do say if you'd like a follow-up workshop where you can actually get more concrete experience of what ontologies actually look and feel like and how to use them for particular purposes, because that's when any kind of methodology comes alive, is when you're trying to solve a problem, generate new knowledge, address new issues. do that, and there's a feedback form up at the moment. Please do fill that in. I'm glad to see there are still 44 of you left at the end of this hour and a half. We'll leave this feedback form up for a bit, and really hope that you have got something from this webinar. As was mentioned, ontologies, they're not new. They've been around for a long time. I mean, look at evolution and Darwin, and species and genuses, etc. But they are new in the more formal sense of being able to develop them sufficiently rigorously that they can really link domains and be computer readable. And they're especially new to behavioural and social sciences. Last year, actually, this would be a good thing to put in the chat, the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine in the United States put out a report. I mean, it was developed over a long time with some very eminent people involved about using ontologies to advance behavioural and social science research. And really recognise that this is an incredibly important tool for taking things forward. So do have a read of that. It really lays out very well the need for ontologies in this area, the case for them, what we currently know, and some case studies of how they've been used. So early days, but really hope that you're persuaded that this is a methodological advance that is well worth exploring. So a few more minutes if you want to put any questions or indeed comments. Very, very well received. Tom, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was only going to say that if anybody's unsure how to engage with ontologies, I'd really recommend just doing what Janna suggested. Go on the ontology lookup service and type in a few words that represent what you do. So I think Axel put a question in saying, do any of us work on cybersecurity? I don't think any of us do. Please correct me if I'm wrong and jump in. But I went on the ontology lookup service, type in cybersecurity, and there's one ontology on there. What a great place to start. Let's click on that. Let's look at those concepts, look at those definitions. Do they fit with your understanding? Could it be developed? How could you start to use that ontology in your work? Or how could you contribute to that ontology? I just think that's a very easy way for people to start.
Yeah, that's great. And in terms of behaviour change intervention ontology, which probably quite a few people on the call will be interested in, we have on I think is it the Human Behaviour Change Project YouTube channel, Robert? We have, I think about 10 or so modules, training modules for the behaviour change intervention ontology, what it is, how to use it. Robert was leading on this work. So Robert, do you want to say a few words about that and how people can find that? Because I think that would be a very good sort of next step in terms of getting more engaged with actually the details of a particular ontology.
Yeah, they're all on YouTube in the Human Behaviour Change the Human Behaviour Change Project channel. So you could probably find them. I could just try looking at it just now and see if I can get it on YouTube. But we can put a link in anyway so that you can see it. And there's about 10 of them. And there's 9. I think there's 9 at the moment, and we've got another 3 in the pipeline.
Great, thanks very much, Robert. Good. Okay. Well, thanks to all of the speakers, and as I think has become evident, and I should have made clearer right at the beginning, we're a team from Sheffield University and University College London. Janna is an associate member there, and we are all working together on a project that Tom outlined, Behavioural Research UK. So we will have another webinar, I don't know how long from now, maybe next spring, reporting on the projects that we've been doing and what we've produced, which will be tools to make all this area more accessible. Very good. So thank you all of you who came to the webinar. We really value your feedback to give it. And if those of you who would like a follow-on workshop, we look forward to seeing you there, and hopefully we can have a more interactive platform at that point. And thanks to all the speakers too. And do stay on if you have got time.